right, folks, welcome to session number 9 of our Sunday Schooled. Our guest today is David Finnegan-Hosey, the author of Christ on the Psych Ward and Grace is a Pre-Existing Condition, Faith Systems and Mental Health Care. I'm going to talk a little bit during our worship service, but also at the end of David's conversation about how, because these are copies for one of you to actually win or earn, and I have a couple ways you can do that. They're both autographed by David himself. Now, how I stumbled upon David is through a Facebook ad, actually, and the ad was talking about these books on sale currently, with the proceeds going to forgiving or helping to forgive student loan debt for first responders during the who are being majorly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I thought, man, that's amazing. I want to buy the book just for that alone. Then I've been reading them, and they are fantastic, wonderful writing. And so I thought everybody's got to hear from David on this. So without further ado, please welcome David Finnegan-Hosey.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, thanks everyone for having me with you across the miles here. My name is David, and I serve as the college chaplain at a little college called Barton College in Wilson, North Carolina. In eastern North Carolina, we're like vinegar barbecue country. And Barton's a little Disciples of Christ affiliated college, about 1,000 students. I'm the chaplain here. I've worked in campus ministry for about the past 10 years or so in a number of different places. And in addition to that, write and talk a bit about mental health and mental illness, mental health struggles, and faith, and how we can kind of have conversations at the cross points of all these different topics. So I'll start by just sharing a little bit of my story and a bit of why I'm passionate about the topic of mental health and destigmatizing conversations around mental illness in church and in our faith communities. And the story roughly starts in 2011. I had just finished my first year of seminary. I was in Washington, D.C., going to seminary, training to become a pastor, and finished my first year, and everything was going great. Externally, like my life was good. I had a good first year of this master's program, and internally felt like everything was kind of coming apart at the seams, and it was confusing. There was this disconnect between my outward reality and the inward experience of my reality that was confusing and scary. And got into the summer, and it was like getting worse and worse and spiraling, and I was isolating myself and doing things that were risky. And friends started to notice slowly that something was going on, and eventually things got pretty scary for me. And with the help of some friends, I went to the hospital, and I admitted myself into the hospital and ended up in the psychiatric unit for a couple of weeks. And I was there for, I think, 2 weeks, and got a bit stable, was feeling safer, left the hospital, and then was back in the hospital a few weeks later. And I sort of bounced from inpatient to an outpatient program, then back into inpatient, and eventually ended up at a hospital in Connecticut, and was there for a longer period of time, several months. And it was there at that hospital in Connecticut that I was diagnosed with a type of bipolar disorder, type 2 bipolar disorder, and got a diagnosis and got some medications that seemed to help me establish more of a stable baseline for myself, and some therapies and some techniques that helped me learn how to manage this emotional storm that had been raging over the past 6 months at this point. And came back to Washington, D.C., and things were hard for a long time. At first, I couldn't go back to school and wasn't sure whether I would be able to go back to school, and was just struggling, learning how to manage this mental health condition that I now had this awareness of, and also feeling a bit adrift, maybe a bit of a lack of purpose and meaning in my life, and also trying to learn how to navigate this mental health care system that I now was a part of, right? Was a piece of the system. And during that time, when I'm adrift and feeling a little meaningless, I started working with some students at a nearby university. And I had initially been scheduled to start as an intern with this campus ministry in the fall, and then I'd gone to Connecticut and went to the hospital. So it felt like I had met these students and met some of the student leaders and then just disappeared for several months. And then I was back, right? So I thought, well, I got to give like some kind of explanation for where I've been, and lying feels really exhausting. Like that would take a lot of work. And so I was scheduled to give a sermon in one of our Thursday night worship services. And I talked a little bit about my experience in the hospital. And I talked about this passage in the Gospel of John where Jesus calls the disciples his friends. And I talked about like this, if we think of Jesus as like the human face for us of God, and Jesus calls us friends, like maybe God knows a little bit about what it means to be lonely and to want friends. And about, the importance, like how lonely an experience this had been, but at the same time, the importance of friendship for me in the midst of this experience. And, I included this, I was preaching the sermon, so I, obviously wanted to talk about the scripture and talk about the story and how it related to my students' lives, but I also wanted them to know I was okay, right? I'm all right, I'm fine, I'm back. We can now get back to the work of ministry that we're supposed to be doing together. I can kind of leave this behind, right? Except that's not what happened at all. What happened is that students started coming to me one by one at first and saying things like, I really struggle with anxiety and depression, or, I've got this family member that has a severe mental illness. It's really hard on them. It's really hard on their family. Or I've got a friend or a roommate who's going through a really hard, dark time right now, and don't really know what to do about it or what to call it. And then they all said something like, we didn't know we could talk about it in church, but now you have, and so now we know we can. So this was like a revelation, right? This is an opening of my eyes to the fact that this story, rather than being something that I needed to like kind of explain and then get behind me so we could get on with the work of ministry, this was actually a doorway into what we were supposed to be doing here, right? That this was, by going first, I could create space where other people felt safe to share stories that maybe they implicitly or explicitly had picked up from prior faith communities they weren't supposed to talk about here. They weren't supposed to talk about this in church. And to be able to say like, no, this is what we're about, right? We're about bringing our whole selves to God and each other so that we can learn how to better love each other and thus how to better love God. So I started doing this, started going first, started sharing a bit of my story to try to create some space for folks to share stories that have perhaps they'd been afraid to speak up about, or had felt a sense of stigma around, or a sense of shame around. And, framing for faith communities some of the theological and the spiritual questions that surround that work. So that's kind of what led to my first book, which is, again, Christ on the Psych Ward. Ta-da. Very nice cover by Paul Supase. And that's been good work. I've been doing that now, since for the past 8 years or so. But as I started doing this, I also started realizing how important it was to say, as I was going to tell my story of mental health struggle, that my story isn't the one single story, that there are actually a lot of different stories. And that, in fact, there are different difficulties and different challenges in those stories and different barriers to telling those stories that are important for us to talk about, important to include more voices so that we can have the really big, bold conversation that we need to have about mental health in this country. So I'll give you just kind of two examples of what I mean. And this kind of leads to the more recent, my second book. Okay. So one thing is, when I came back to Washington, D.C. from Connecticut, I found out from my insurance company that I had a pre-existing condition. which was like news to me. And I'm like, cool. They let me know this in a nice letter where they said like, hey, congratulations, you have a pre-existing condition. So you know all those hospitals that you were just in. Good luck paying for those. So I ended up in medical debt, like a lot of medical debt. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars of debt from these hospitalizations, right? And worrying about that debt and feeling anxious about that debt and trying to figure out like the insurance system and setting up appointments and the mental health care system and different medications, I learned that figuring out the mental health care systems and the spider web of systems around it was almost as big, if not a bigger, mental health challenge for me than the actual bipolar disorder, right, that I had been diagnosed with and was learning how to manage. So there are these systems and these barriers to accessing care that are very real and that we need to grapple with. I write in the more recent book, Grace is a Pre-Existing Condition. There's a chapter in there about debt and the way that Christian theologians and our Jewish ancestors and modern day Jewish theologians grapple with debt, talk about debt as a spiritual issue, talk about forgiveness of debt as this really core piece of our faith, right? And so lots of the proceeds or the profits from this most recent book have been donated to this organization called RIP Medical Debt, which buys up medical debt with the same system that debt collectors use to buy it up and then forgives it instead of collecting on it. So instead of getting a letter from a debt collector saying, hey, where's the money for this medical bill? You get a letter that says you're not in medical debt anymore. And this is like a biblical tradition, the declaration of Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor, which is a forgiveness of debts. So that's like one example, right, of like, if I just tell you a story that's like, hey, I had this really hard time in my life, and then I went to the hospital and I got diagnosed, and then I was able to tell that story and help other people share their stories. Like, that's a good story, right? I like that story. It's hard, it's tough, but it's a good story, right? But that leaves out this thing that's this real challenge within that story. That's actually a huge systemic barrier to folks getting help. Or folks being able to then like, pay for that help and access that type of help, right? So that's one example. The second example that I'll give you real quick. Around the same time, I'm back in Washington, D.C., and I'm meeting with a psychotherapist who is talking to me about this type of group therapy that I'm going to be involved in. And she says to me, it's great that you're here. We don't usually have men in our groups. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Why do you suppose that is? And she said, well, I know why that is. It's because most men with your diagnosis end up in jail. So the reality is that mass incarceration and chronic homelessness and the revolving door between those two have replaced a functioning mental health system for a whole lot of people in our country. So if I'm going to talk about mental health, if I'm going to share my story about mental health and mental health struggle, we need to also be sure that we're listening to the voices of folks who have been left out of that system and who in fact have had really traumatic experiences rather than experiences of care and compassion. So that's part of this bigger, deeper conversation that we need to have about mental health care, both in our churches and in our country at large. So I started talking about this and writing about this, and I noticed an interesting thing. Our language about mental health care and healthcare in general in our country is unconsciously and surprisingly rather spiritual, rather theological. We often don't realize it, but a lot of the words we use when we talk about healthcare are words that have this resonance within our Christian tradition. And if we can maybe bring some of that to the surface and have some healthier theological conversations about that, maybe we can also have some healthier systems that emerge out of that. Now, in fairness, I went to seminary, I have a master's of divinity. So sometimes like you end up with a hammer and everything looks like a nail, right? So maybe I'm just like, the healthcare system can be fixed with theology, but like, yeah, it's worth a shot. So, so just to give an example, right? The title of my new book is Grace is a Pre-Existing Condition, right? And pre-existing condition, actually, if I just say the word, like in 2020, if I say pre-existing, and then ask you to fill in the blank that's next, a lot of people will say pre-existing condition, and they'll think I'm talking about healthcare, right? And health insurance, debates around healthcare and health insurance. But pre-existence is actually this like old Christian theological saw, right? So the first use of the term pre-existing condition in English language publication, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is in the 1940s in a Reno, Nevada newspaper. And this is around the same time as what the system that looks kind of like our modern healthcare and insurance system has been coming into existence in our country. So that's the first time in English that pre-existing condition is used in reference to healthcare. But the first time that pre-existing is used in the English language in publication is in the 1500s, and it's in a theological textbook. And it's talking about the pre-existence of God and the pre-existence of Christ, which is the thing Christians fought about back before we came up with other things to fight about. I mean, like the early church was like fisticuffs about the pre-existence of Christ. And there's a theologian named Gregory who is so annoyed. He writes that about how annoyed he is that he walks around the streets of Alexandria and everybody is arguing about the pre-existence of Christ. And he literally writes like, I can't even get a haircut without people arguing about this, right? So this is like an old, Christians struggling with the idea of like, what does it mean that Christ is pre-existing? What does God's pre-existence mean to us, right? So I think this is really interesting because what this debate is about how we start our stories, right? How do we begin telling the story of our faith? And if we begin with pre-existence, if we begin with the pre-existence of God, and then creation is this gracious, grace-filled act of God, that leads us then to tell the rest of the story in a different way. Now, often we don't start the story like that. Often we start the story with a story about sin and pathology and brokenness, but actually like God pre-exists that, right? Creation pre-exists that story. Well, there's a parallel here with our language around healthcare. Talking about pre-existing conditions starts our story about healthcare with pathology. It's brokenness, right? What the insurance companies were saying to me when they sent me this letter was, hey, like before you asked us to cover you, you were already sick, and in a way that's too sick for us to be able to risk it, right? It's the language of like risk management. That's insurance language. Right? But as Christians, we actually have a much deeper language than risk management language and insurance language. We have this language of assurance, which is like, y'all are Methodist, right? Good United Methodist here. Okay, great. So John Wesley, right, goes and hangs out with the Moravians at Aldersgate, and he has this experience which like hilariously and Britishly is like they're reading the preface to like Luther's commentary on Letter to the Romans. It's like not exactly like I don't know, it's not exactly a revival, but Wesley has this moment where he says, I felt my heart strangely warmed, and I realized that me, yes, even me, right? I am forgiven, I am loved, I am justified by the grace of God, right? That moment, like very important for the Wesleyan tradition, where John Wesley feels that assurance of God, right? That assurance of salvation. So the language of assurance is deep in our tradition. And it's not about like buying my way into heaven, right? It's not about risk management for my future. It's about this like present reality of God in my life, claiming me and healing me and making me whole. Okay. So what if we could bring that sort of perspective to our conversations around mental health and around healthcare? In contrast, I was driving, I think I was driving through West Virginia when I was visiting churches talking about my first book, and I saw a little church that had a sign on it that said, "Come inside for your fire insurance." Right? So like, come inside, right? Get saved, and that'll save you from the fires of hell. So salvation then is about risk management. It's like you got to buy into the insurance policy so that you can be protected from the risk of like future fiery damnation. I would much rather us have a conversation about assurance And I think like looking at that contrast actually helps us then come to a different sort of understanding when we talk about mental health and mental health care. So that's kind of like what emerges for me in this more recent book is like, let's have this bigger, deeper, broader conversation about the systems that impact people's ability to get help, about just and equitable access to care, and about the very way that we frame conversations around mental health and around mental health care, so that instead of questions about like individual pathology, brokenness, sickness, we're actually having much bigger, deeper conversation about like, what does it look like to be a community that cares for and uplifts the voice of people who are struggling, people who have hard stories to tell, but stories that if we open up space for them, become part of this bigger conversation that moves out into our communities in ways that I think can affect real change. So I'll stop there. That's a lot. That's like a fire hose from like a guy I just met on Zoom telling me he has bipolar disorder to like the entirety of the American healthcare system. I know that's a lot. So I'll stop, and questions or comments or stories to share or anything, it's open. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So I will read any questions that come in. And if you're with us on the Zoom call, of course, let me know and I'll unmute you and you can ask questions. But I'll begin with a question of just how did you notice you were shifting the conversation? You know, your book was, giving a space for people just to share their story to more of now a bigger thing. How did the conversations you were having in your setting, how did they change with your change that you were taking in this direction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I think an increasing awareness of the voices, the range of voices that are left out, if it's just my voice speaking, or even if it's like my voice and then other people's voices who share a socioeconomic background with me, a racial background with me, a faith background with me, right? Like if I'm speaking in a church and me and most of the people in that church have relatively similar backgrounds, then we're going to have some crossover stories, right? Now, each of our stories is going to be different, but like when, has my congregation heard from somebody who has been incarcerated rather than receiving mental health care? And if not, then I need to be really intentional about making sure that voice, if it's not like somebody sitting right beside me, is at least being included in my writing and in my speaking, and right. And this is like a basic kind of precept too of like how we do Bible study, right? We got to ask the question, like we've got, we've all got interpretations that we bring, but there's also some voices that aren't in the room here. What might some of those voices have to say about this text? So I think that increasing awareness of like, who are the voices that are missing and what are the conversations that come up when those missing voices are included? Some of them are different conversations than what came up for me, right? Like conversations about incarceration in the prison system, right? That wasn't a conversation that came up for me.
Right.
I write in the book about when I was in campus ministry at Georgetown University, we would lead these hypothermia outreach teams that went out on the coldest nights of the year to check in on folks who were sleeping on the streets and see if they were willing to take shelter for the night. And a lot of the folks on the streets either had a chronic mental illness or they'd ended up on the streets for some other reason, and the trauma of being homeless has now created mental health struggles. Yep. So I'm talking to folks that like I've got something in common with, right? That the students don't necessarily know. Like I'm talking to folks who are there because they have bipolar disorder. I have bipolar disorder. But like my experience and their experience, there's this like chasm between us, right? So how do we bridge that chasm and like bring my story, your story together into this bigger conversation?
It's good. And one thing I do appreciate in your writing that I've read so far is that you are pretty clear. You're not there to speak for every person who has mental health issues. You're a very specific story and everyone is different, and you're not even going to presume to present their stories. That's for them to do. And I really appreciate that aspect. Okay. one person had a question, just maybe kind of a basic question. They wanted to know, what is bipolar 2? They have family members who have bipolar disease, but didn't know what maybe bipolar 2 is.
Sure. Yeah. So bipolar disorder used to more commonly be called manic depressive disorder. And so the poles are mania and depression. So bipolar type 1 bipolar disorder is what most people, if you know something about bipolar disorder, you would probably tend to associate with type 1 bipolar disorder. And that's really high highs that are called hypermania. And then like pretty sharp crashes down into depression. Bipolar 1's it's more common for people with type 1 bipolar disorder to have during that high to maybe have symptoms of psychosis that go with that, or auditory or visual hallucinations that might go with that. That's less common with bipolar 2. Bipolar 2 tends to have slightly lower highs, hypomania instead of hypermania, and then sort of long drawn out lows. And so often type 1 bipolar disorder presents as more, you could say, like extreme at first, but type 2 bipolar is often more difficult to spot. Okay. Easier to kind of like pass. Like I probably had the symptoms of type 2 bipolar starting when I was 15 or 16 and got diagnosed when I was 26, right? So kind of a long time between when those symptoms started onsetting and when finally I got diagnosed. Now, my particular bipolar 2 is also rapid cycling in mixed states. So that actually looks even a little bit different, where if type 1 is a real high and then a real hard crash, type 2 is a bit of a lower high and then a longer lower low. Mine looks sort of like a Richter scale. It's like, whee. And so I can, when I'm in having an episode, my sort of like think about like extreme mood swings and then just sort of like supercharge them. So like from the lowest low to the highest high that I experience, back and forth, sometimes within the course of a day or even the course of like an hour, right?
Wow.
And so the way I would describe it for folks who haven't had the experience is like, it's like if like usually I'm in the driver's seat and my emotions are a passenger, and they can be like a quiet passenger or like a really annoying passenger, right? But like in an episode of bipolar disorder, they're in the front seat, like they're in control. It's like I'm taking a back seat to this emotional content that's just kind of out of my control. So yeah, I think that's a short take there. Yeah.
Awesome. So Matthew in the group chat there, maybe you've seen it, but he kind of asked a question about the kind of like the more traditional Christian view is to present as more exclusive and like an insurance rather than assurance view. So what along the way, where did you have a shift to a more inclusive Christian assurance view as opposed to the insurance view?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I think we can talk about inclusion and exclusion. I think you're probably right that if you're picking up on that, I tend to have a more inclusive view, though I'm not sure that insurance and assurance is necessarily inherently about inclusion and exclusion. I think it's more about viewing how we view salvation and whether we view salvation as a sort of hedging our bets against a future damnation, right? Versus what I actually think is the more orthodox Christian position of the assurance of salvation. Wesley's pretty orthodox, right? He's not exactly a theological liberal in any kind of modern sense that we would mean the term. But what he believes is that grace is something that in fact like precedes me and comes into my life now in justification, and then transforms me forward into sanctification. I used to be Methodist, y'all, so like I got this. I went to Wesley Seminary. You can take the like guy out of the Methodist, but not really the Methodist.
That's right.
But the distinction I'm making there is, I think, less about exclusion and inclusion, though we could also have a conversation about that, and more about soteriology, the theology of salvation. Like, how do we think about what it means to be saved? And what I see a lot of more modern Western Christian theologies doing is presenting salvation as this, like, whatever it is your particular tradition believes, like you say this prayer, or you get baptized, or you do this particular thing, and then you're like, you're bought into the policy, right? Like you've signed the contract, and so then you're protected, you've hedged your bets against the future risk. I actually don't think that's the Orthodox Christian position. I think assurance of salvation, and the sanctifying impact of that assurance is actually closer to an older Orthodox position than than say the Jesus prayer and then you're done.
Yeah, I agree. I have a question about you're talking about theology in terms of the how we approach medical debt and the systems of access and things like that. How has theology, you don't need to single out any specific theology, but have you seen any theological connection to someone's own individual mental health, harmful versus helpful?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple different angles to look at this from, I think. One is that, like in bipolar disorder, for example, like hyperreligiosity can be a symptom of bipolar disorder or of mania. So, I mean, I've lost track of the number of people who said like, oh, Christ on the Psych Ward, is this about like how you thought you were Jesus? Which it's not. That was never my burden. Like, I was very convinced I was not Jesus, actually. Right. So there can be particular forms of religiosity or religious language that actually emerge out of the symptomology of mental illness, and also at the same time, psychiatric and therapeutic professions have often been really uncomfortable with religiosity. And so sometimes there's this give and take between a very real question of like, is somebody's religiosity coming out in an unhealthy way as part of an unhealth, or do you have a therapist or a psychiatrist who actually just like doesn't really know how to handle religious language? So I'll give you an example from my experience. I had a psychiatrist who asked me if he thought my faith had been part of me, had been kind of an important part of me staying alive, and then like doing the work of trying to work towards health and wholeness. And I said, oh yeah, like without a doubt, like couldn't do it without Jesus, right? And he was like, yeah, that's interesting. Like I've had, a lot of people say that the only reason they didn't die by suicide is because they were worried about going to hell. Well, so that's not actually what I meant, right? That's not what I was talking about. Now, like, if that is something that for someone is a buffer that's keeping them alive, like, cool, like we'll go with that, right? But like, that's actually not my belief or my theology. And like this guy like knew what he was talking about when he was talking about psychiatric medication and dosages, but like he had never had like a in-depth conversation about like different understandings of salvation, right? And maybe and like why should he have, right? Necessarily,
right.
So just being aware of that gap, I think sometimes between the language of medication and the language of therapy and the language of faith is part of why I do the work I do, right? Because I think like actually we can bridge that gap, right? We can and should and need to be working together, because statistics consistently show that in the US, at least, people who are experiencing mental health crisis are more likely to seek out a faith leader or member of the clergy first before they seek out a member of the mental health profession, for better or for worse, right? That's just like what the data shows us. So like we as pastors, clergy, chaplain types need to have some language around that, but also like therapists and psychiatrists need to have some literacy, right? Some religious literacy. To sort of be able to know and understand and read that. So sorry, that was like a long answer to a short question, but
that's good. That's great.
Couple different pieces there.
Is there a way, we'll make this the last one. Is there a way a church, let's say they're just beginning, like, okay, we recognize we need to make this a place where people can share their stories. I don't mean like, hey, give me the process, but is there a good just stepping in point that you might recommend?
Yeah, so I'll name a couple different things. I mean, one, like, just to plug it, right? You can buy my book, and they're on my website. There's a free study guide for the first book, and the study guide for the second book will be coming out soon. So that's one way to do it, right? You could do a book group. You could read the book and do the study guides. That's one way, right? A second way, a great way to start, is to host a mental health first aid training at your church. Mental health first aid it's something I'm certified in. And right, if you think about a first aid training, right, like it's like, I'm not a doctor, but there's an immediate need and I can kind of like respond to that immediate need until the professionals are here, right?
Yep.
So mental health first aid, similar concept, right? Some basic literacy and understanding that I can have, so that I can respond in a moment of crisis until we can like get to a safer, kind of more professional environment. So that's a second thing. And then the third thing I'd say is this comes to the story, right? So I was talking to a pastor in Chicago whose congregation had been part of a community organizing effort where they were doing these listening sessions in the community, hearing from the community, like, what are your concerns? What are you worried about? Mental health like rose to the top of the list. And the pastor was like, I don't know anything about this topic. What do I do? So he started just in his prayers of the people every week. I don't know if you all do something like this in your congregation, right? But he would name people with mental health struggles in his prayers. And so he's telling me this story. So you have to imagine, like, we're on the phone. He's telling me the story. And he said, so the first week I prayed for people who were experiencing anxiety. And then the second week, I prayed for people experiencing depression. And on the third week, I prayed for people experiencing bipolar disorder. And I got like choked up on the phone with him. And like, I've been like talking, you can kind of tell, like, I've been telling the story a little while, like, I'm kind of comfortable with it, right? It's like, it's fine. Like, it was really, really hard in 2011, but like, I can talk about it now and be okay, right? I almost started crying because here's this like guy I've never met whose congregation was praying for like people like me without knowing me, right? Wow. That's really, really powerful. And it normalizes mental health and mental health struggles. But it's something we know how to do, right? We know how to do as a church. Well, we know how to pray, right? So let's pray about, we know how to like make casseroles, right? Yep. So like, that's, sometimes people refer to like mental health struggles as like, it's like mental illness is the non-casserole illness, right? Like if somebody gets a scary diagnosis, we bake, we set up a meal train, somebody gets a mental health diagnosis. Sometimes it's like, we don't know what to do, right? Well, like, meal trains, right? We gotta know what to do when people get hard news.
Right.
There's not necessarily anything that has to prevent those same kind of things from being what we take on as communities of faith. So that's more than one thing, but that gives you a couple different places to start.
I love it. That's fantastic. Those are two very creative ideas: the mental health first aid, and make your casserole. You're so right. When people have that like devastating mental health news, why do we? Bake something, bring them food, let them know. Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. I love it. Very cool. Well, David, thank you so much for joining us. And David did share his website address there. I also put it over in the live stream, but it's davidfinnegan-hosey.com. I'll make sure that it's highlighted in the comments as well. So if you have any, if you want to find his books, if you want to maybe send him a question, I'm sure he's got a contact. Yeah, he definitely has a contact form there. So
Yeah.
please feel free to do that. And David, thanks again so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, sure thing. And if you'd like a signed copy of the book, feel free to contact me through the website. Those profits will go to RIP medical debt, and every dollar donated to RIP medical debt can be used to buy and forgive $100 of medical debt.
Whoa!
And so it's a great, it's a lot of bang for your buck. That's awesome. Weird way that the medical debt system works. That's a whole separate conversation.
Right.
But those profits will go to RIP medical debt. And the average family who has unpaid medical debt in this country has about a $600 bill that they can't pay off. So $6 forgives that, right? $6 donation to RIP medical debt forgives that. So you can do a lot of good. Give, if you have money and you want to give to them directly, awesome. But if you buy one of my books from me directly, you get a signed copy, and the profits will go.
That is awesome. Thank you so much.
And thanks
David.
for being here, Matthew.
Fantastic idea. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your time today.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see you later.
All right. Thanks so much, you all. Appreciate it.